man, with that intro, I can only possibly let you down. Thanks for coming out here and not having your post-lunch nap. I really appreciate that. Yeah, hey, I'm Chris. I'm the CTO at Reddit. To start off with a kind of brief history of me. Actually, yeah, I got my start doing experimental physics. I use it every day in that gravity still seems to operate on me. And I got started actually as founding engineer at Reddit in 2005. For those who don't know what a founding engineer is, it's a fancy way of describing somebody who at one point worked entirely for pizza and kind of moved on from there. Or as my mom described it, what are you doing with your life? It worked out, actually, in the long term. Mostly the time I was doing kind of platform and infrastructure work. The redesign that I'm going to talk about here is actually also almost entirely my fault, the original stack. Now that I'm the CTO, it means that the redesign is also probably entirely my fault. So really, I'm to blame for everything. So first off, got to do the standard intro to what is Reddit. Just curious, how many people here use Reddit? How many people here consider themselves a Reddit user? Different groups. Well, thank you for coming back, and thank you to all the lurkers. Lurkers are people too. Just to kind of do the standard intro. Reddit, we've traditionally called ourselves the front page of the internet. That notion's had some staying power, but what it's actually kind of evolved into is we're kind of a social network where we have thousands of communities where people can talk about their interests and passions. And we really put the conversation part first. We're kind of like the real last place online where you have like long-form conversations happening. And we're also kind of a big deal. We do actually have a fair amount of traffic. We're like the biggest little site that no one's ever heard of. We're usually somewhere between 4 and 6 on Alexa. I'm glad to see after all these years they finally fixed their algorithm. We have about 350 million monthly active users. Kind of around 1 million communities, 10 million posts per month, 3 million comments per day, and about 58 million votes. So it's actually a lot to deal with. The graph over on the side is actually showing kind of live, or when we took the live post and comment submissions. The blue's posts and the red is comments. So lots of things happening. And our purpose is to bring community and belonging to everyone in the world. And so with that notion in mind, the way to think about this kind of redesign is that we have to build an experience that appeals to everybody. It's so simple. Everyone loves the same things. One part of this is that change is actually really hard in general, and it's especially hard on Reddit, and here's why. So here is, back in the day, this is the first version of Reddit, 2005, which happens to be, in terms of timelines, Facebook was 2004, Twitter was 2006. So this is like really pretty far back there. You'll notice this strong affinity to the current version of Reddit. In fact, here's kind of speeding through the time, 2009, adding some more cruft, and just kind of, oh, look, we had an ad unit finally in 2013, great. 2017, not really drastic changes here. So, especially for Redditors, we're talking about taking an experience which they've kind of come to rely on and doing something with it, which of course is absolutely terrifying. One of the primary reasons that Reddit exists is it's a platform for Redditors to criticize Reddit. And so with that in mind, we're kind of set up in the state of trying to make it more welcoming, but at the same time having to listen to everybody telling us that we're destroying the site. So the why for the redesign should be pretty clear here. I mean, the why is, to start with, it's about perception, right? We don't want to look like, my favorite description of Reddit's aesthetic was, we look like a dystopian Craigslist, which I think is a really high bar to hit. I'm really actually proud of that one. What we want to do is make it welcoming. So I think to us, like, brand perception and making the experience welcoming are basically the same thing. And on top of it all, part of having a stack that is about 8 to 10 years old, developer velocity is a very important thing. We're growing as a company as well as a site. The stack is old. The current production version prior to the redesign was using jQuery, for those people who remember it. Pre-React, pre-Angular. It actually works fairly well, but of course, it's accumulated a lot of cruft over the years. And so the first step here is to really start to think about building a foundation. What's the new stack going to look like? And with any kind of redesign, you have to deal with this, right? Second system syndrome. For those of you who don't know it, the way I like to describe it is that for any sufficiently complicated product change or project change, there's this natural conversation that kind of happens all the time, which is, while we're in there, and then you start to rebuild things. And before you know it, you've taken your simple, we should do a front page redesign, and now your stack is entirely in a combination of Scala and Elm, and for some reason you can only support fonts with serifs. And so you kind of have to deal with that as the feature creep and kind of make sure it doesn't actually happen, or at least mitigate it as much as possible. And so what we kind of did to try to stop this was to break up the rewrite from the redesign bits. And the rewrite was going to have to happen anyway, so we actually had a chance to actually go through, start rebuilding the stack. In our cases, we actually started using React pretty early on. And separately, break off a design team whose entire job it is to try to figure out what should the new stack look like. We also had a big advantage here in that in 2016, we didn't have our own first-party mobile apps. We've had a giant ecosystem of third-party apps, which we still have, and we love them. They're a great engine for innovation. And so we were able to actually build a new experience for Reddit without having a prior art to compare to, which makes it a lot more straightforward to kind of iterate and design and build something that looks a lot more like a modern experience. The counterpoint to that is that the users noticed pretty quickly that there was a slight difference between the two stacks. And this was a good motivation. This is a good motivation to say, hey, maybe this whole redesign thing is a good idea. So the next phase really is to get into the design side. I am an engineer by training. I know enough about design to know that designers are, to see a designer is very good at their job and to feel really good about it, because I know I couldn't do that, as evidenced by the early versions of Reddit. One of the things we added was a Redesign Wardroom. So we basically let these designers kind of go off and be creative, which is a very hard thing to do, right? It's like you don't just say to somebody, okay, it's time to be creative. Please start being creative now. We need to get this out. And so this included going to full bore, design sprints. We established a war room. I managed to, they had an entire conference room dedicated to redesigns with, as you can see on this, like these lovely printouts of what the new site could look like. I managed to not get a big ball of string and beautiful mind it all into a spiral, but it was actually lovely. And also, they dedicated an entire day to crazy ideas. And so the intention here was to not say we're going to do something radically different, but what would something radically different look like? And that at least got us a chance to get out of our box. So once you've got these kind of initial set of new designs, the new question is, could we actually even live here? One of the advantages is that, of course, people who work at Reddit also use Reddit. One of the problems is people who work at Reddit also use Reddit. And so we actually had a chance to basically dog food this ourselves, like actually ask employees, hey, would you actually use this? Because we had the full gambit of very core engaged users, this guy, and much more casual kind of newer users. And so we did concept interviews. We actually, had people try out. InVision is a magical thing. I love it. I'm amazed that, if it existed back in the day, the site might look a little bit better today. We had a chance to actually check and see, is this something that, before we actually expose to anyone in the outside world who might decide to blog about it and say that we are incompetent, which they would do anyway, would this actually help us achieve our goals, and will this actually look good? So next up, once we kind of hit that, not a small milestone, but definitely an important one, we actually spun up an entire user research team from scratch to start to interview users. With that, it was actually getting full-blown working mock-ups. At this point, the stack was actually advanced enough that we could actually build some of these early mock-ups into it. Here's an example of a video call that's actually going on between our head of user research and a user. And it was great because it gave us a chance to actually talk to somebody and help to find out not only what their problems were, but what their concerns were. And the issue we run up against is that the people who are most engaged and most into Reddit have no problem expressing their concerns on the platform. You're not going to get that from a new user. New user's going to come along, say, eh, and just bounce. And so, it gave us an opportunity to hear the full gauntlet of, I don't know what I'm looking at for the new user, to, why are you trying to destroy Reddit? from the engaged users, and all the variables in between. And actually, honestly, just over a video call, you get much more real, understanding of where the user's coming from, and they can actually point at things and say, I don't like this, or I don't know what I'm looking at in those cases. One of the little bits that we kind of incorporated in the first design was we made some jokes about a hamburger button, and we actually made it shaped like a real hamburger, which I really liked a lot. Stuck around for a while. We gradually switched into a real-looking one, but it's gone through some stylized versions. And so this also, gives us a chance to try Reddit out with a real user base, with actual content, and then start the iteration loop of trying to fix the kind of most fundamental issues. And with a new stack, one of them is always going to be things like performance. That's been an ongoing problem. But just actual product issues like rough spots, unclear UI. There's always a tendency to want to create mystery meat UI. It just kind of happens as a result of the redesign. So that kind of comes back to at the end of the day, the purpose here is not to do something drastically, radically different and to alienate our existing user base, but to find a compromise where we take our current functional and very engaging stack and start to make it look a little bit more modern and a little bit more polished and a little bit more welcoming to more users. And so, fundamentally that means we can't really change how Reddit works. There should still be voting arrows. Voting arrows are the most important thing on Reddit. They're actually more fundamental than commenting. We only had commenting 6 months in. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that users will be change averse. And that means that we're not going to be able to do something that is too subtle, but definitely should be amenable to thinking about the current stack and looking at it in a way that isn't too different. And then the kind of last big thing here is that the fundamental unit on Reddit isn't so much the user, it's the community. And so as part of this redesign, we have to basically make sure that the very mechanics that have helped to foster communities on Reddit still function. And that really means putting communities first in this redesign and thinking about what are they going to need, what are moderators who are, at the end of the day, the reason why Reddit works is because we have a giant base of moderators who, mostly through the goodness of their heart, are willing to put time and energy into making sure communities function. And so early on in our rollout process, we started engaging with moderators very, very early to make sure that we address their concerns. And so that means also that we have to be able to understand what moderators need and what communities need, and those should be hopefully the same thing. And also to make the design and iteration process part of their journey. So it feels like they're actually working with us rather than it being a very confrontational, you're changing everything out from under us. And one of the early things that came on was actually CSS. So a very old, very important feature of Reddit. I think what really helped get communities off the ground is we actually allow arbitrary styling of communities with CSS. And that's great. You get experiences like this one, which I don't think anyone here would think that's Reddit unless you actually knew it. And the side effect, though, is of course, CSS is it's a very powerful tool. It also means the DOM effectively gets locked in. It meant there was no way to actually start to do subtle iterations. Like once we had enough CSS usage from third parties, we can't change anything. Like we had a div in this, and it breaks the layout on half of the site, and we can actually fix it very easily. So the solution we kind of went towards was, well, it turns out that there's a set of the first 90% of features that all communities were actually using as a part of their styling. We started building out a toolkit for actually doing customization with this control panel. So you have here kind of the most basic functionality. We still allow for some CSS here and there, but in a much more restricted scope. We've been kind of going back and forth on how much there. And the intention is to allow for personalization, but to make sure that we can still actually move the entire product and not break anything. Another nice feature of having it this way is that, if you think about for apps are not going to run CSS. So we already have a problem where since we have our mobile traffic is going up, users aren't necessarily seeing this customization. And so providing a means of actually configuring it via checkboxes and via uploading individual images made a big difference. And so here's some examples of with structured styles where you can go. Here's the slightly more stylized hamburger button, it's starting to feel very similar to the old stack in that way. Okay, so next thing up, listen to users.
I've already made the joke several times, but our users don't have a problem being listened to because they complain right on platform. And you know, there's an old joke, of course, about that users don't actually know what they want, or they know what they want, they don't know what they need. And so being able to tease out those two things it can be very tricky. But the important part about there is evolving, right? So the cornerstone of the way we operate is the assumption that our users are going to be more creative than us. At the very least, they outnumber us by about 1,000,000 to 1. So just from sheer statistics, there should be a couple people in there who are pretty creative. But just even with structured styles, or just some of the basic things that we provided as tools, you know, and it's an entire Flare system on Reddit, which is built off of structured styles, or off of CSS, I'm sorry. And we would have never thought of that. Like, there's a whole bunch of creativity there that we want to unleash. And so this means doing things like actually using the platform to have the conversation. We built a dedicated community called Our Redesign that is all about making sure that users have a place to talk about the redesign. And they're able to kind of complain live in a place that's actually constructive, where we can actually pay attention and engage. And that's important to us. And most importantly, we do actually listen and take action. We don't accept everything. We try to make sure people feel like they're at least heard. And we do actually build what most users want. This is my favorite quoting from The Onion. This will likely be a smooth rollout, and no one will have any complaints, as everything that happens on Reddit. Didn't go quite that well, but it went pretty well. And you know, we did actually see people wanting to be part of it. So when we announced that we were going to actually move from this very closed alpha into an open beta, we had a call to action saying, "Hey, if you want to join," oops, back up. "If you want to join, just reply here." And we had 2,000 comments in almost no time at all. And you know, there were some conversations that were a little bit less pleasant, but we also mint pitchforks. That's part of the process. And you know, the users, I think the takeaway from all of this for us is that it's a luxury to have users that are so engaged in your platform that they passionately care about every pixel you change, right? The fact that they're complaining means they love it. And the fact that they're complaining means that they're afraid you're going to break the very fragile, beautiful thing that they see in your platform. And so that's the part that we had to kind of remind ourselves of constantly. Having a community around this and having a way to converse directly with users as they were going through the process of the redesign meant that we also had a chance for PMs and designers to talk directly to users and actually get their knocks when they actually deserve them, or actually be able to explain what we're thinking when we make changes. And this also gave us an opportunity to have advocates on platform. Not everyone on platform is seeing everything that's happening live, and so we had a chance for users who were actually paying attention to say, "Hey, stupid! Look, their blog post was yesterday. Take a look. Here's a link." Because we can't call them stupid, so it's good to have users do that for us. So this meant we could do things like launch early adopters, and actually we started doing badges for users who actually were helpful, or just assisting with styling, assisting with alpha, and we made sure that as part of the first rollout, the first groups that got access to it were mods. Any existing beta users got access to it pretty quickly. We made sure to stay out of their way and let them use the platform and basically tell us what they thought. And we also gave them some things to focus on, like what's going on here. We actually had users building wiki pages up for us of the goodness of their heart on how to do structured styling, how to actually use the new tools before we even had a chance to finish them, which was actually really, really delightful. Okay, metrics. Most important thing here. With all the talk about talk, at the end of the day, if the redesign doesn't actually work and you find out that people can't comment, that's probably a bad thing. The tricky part, of course, is that with a redesign, we're talking about changing. It's a really apples to oranges comparison. Like, we don't really know necessarily what magical thing is broken until we've broken it. And so we just measured everything. We put in, we actually had 10 times more metricing coming out of our redesign than we did out of the primary stack, which, as you can imagine, also meant for some interesting scaling issues in our event pipeline when we started rolling out to the majority of our traffic. We also defined our metrics early on. So we wanted to make sure that overall engagement, like are people voting, are people submitting, are people actually using the redesign? For the early versions, it's really how long do they use it until they opt back out and go back to the old stack, and then just kind of continue iterating. And so the intention here really is to kind of learn, debug, iterate over the course of several months. And so with all this, finally, last April, we went, I wouldn't say full bore, but at least to partial bore, about 10% with a gradual kind of increasing rollout. Our job here has been over this time to basically continue to maintain sentiment and feel like users are being heard. Also scale up. There's a whole bunch of new technologies here that we didn't have much familiarity with. People convinced me that it was an okay idea to have Node in the stack, which, me being a Python chauvinist, took a little bit of work. The whole purpose is to kind of keep track of the benefits, make sure things are predictable, make sure the users feel like they're heard, and listen and iterate. Continue down this path of improvement. This is, I forgot to update this slide. I originally gave this talk closer to Q2. So as you can imagine, this has still been an ongoing process. One of my favorite rules of engineering is that for any sufficiently complicated project, the first 90% of the time on the project goes to the first 90% of the project. The other 10% of the project takes the other 90% of the time. We're deep into that right now. Continuing to iterate. Responsiveness and accessibility are very important. Performance is very important. One does not simply overturn an entire battle-hardened stack and assume everything's going to work. Getting it to a point, though, where every team in the company that isn't dedicated to the redesign can start to build product on it has been the real focus now. We do want the redesign to be the stack, but we have to make sure that it has a good reason to have equal footing with our battle-hardened 10-year-old stack. With that in mind, 330 million users, about 150,000 hours of work so far going into this, 50 people on the team, 4 dedicated teams, all for one giant redesign, which of course, Reddit, we dig it, for the OGs in the room. And just want to shout out to the team. This is our Redesign Team. This was all kicked off originally by the gentleman in the hat here, Naranjan. He actually built the first version of the redesign over his Christmas holiday because we were kind of hemming and hawing about when to do it, and he just built a version of Reddit and React in about 2 weeks, just for fun. We've since managed to build an entire team around that. Anand, our director on this team, we wooed from Microsoft. It was a harrowing process to convince his wife that he should leave his cushy job at Microsoft and come and work with a bunch of clowns like us. Just want to say thanks. I will make the obligatory "we're hiring" plug and open up with time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much.